Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. I'm John Gapper from the Financial Times. Welcome to today's session on productivity and inclusive growth. While everybody's making their way to their seats and sitting down, let me just take the initial opportunity to remind you that you can make your voices heard and actually take part in the panel remotely during the session by participating either on Twitter or a device you have called Wisembly. I think it's called Wisembly. It might be called Wizembly, but anyway, it's either a Wiz or it's very wise. And it's a device, if you check out the postcards on your seat, they'll tell you how to connect. Questions and comments you make during the session will get sent to me by the social media team, and they'll appear on my iPad here so that I can feed them in to the discussion as we go. And we will have some opportunity for direct questions at the end. And just try to use the hashtag for this room, which as you can see is blue. And the hashtag is #OECD Blue. So just to set the scene for our discussion and to check whether or not you know how your device works, I'm going to ask your opinion with a quick poll to start off with on the subject we'll be discussing today. The poll question is, in your view, is the phenomenon of slow productivity growth and that of rising inequality linked? Are those two things linked? So do you want to see whether or not you can vote? Have we baffled everybody? Okay, so I'm going to leave a little bit of time, and now let's see whether or not our social media team can give us a vote, see what people's opinions are. Should be coming any minute. This audience is clearly hand-selected, and we're going to see who at the end of the session we're going to see who on the panel is the most persuasive, and maybe we'll give them a reward, a productivity reward for persuading you. So we'll come to that at the end. We're going to start first with a scene-setting presentation by Gabriela Ramos, the Chief of Staff to the Secretary General, and Gabriela is just going to take us through some of the OECD work on this issue and briefly discuss the points raised. Gabriela.
I'm going to do it through the podium. Thank you very much, John, and good morning, everybody. Incredible that voting really showed almost emblematically how much this topic of inclusion and productivity has been debated all these months among members and the Secretariat. Secretary General presented several of the conclusions of the report, but I want to share a second secret, because he shared one. I'm going to share a second one. I happened to coordinate this report. You have it, the Productivity Inclusiveness Nexus. But this was a real collective effort. Lamia Kamal and Sean Brady from the Inclusive Growth Unit, of course, supported me in that effort. But the work is based on long-standing work of the OECD on productivity and inclusiveness. All the directors contributed. Actually, the chief economist at once just took the pen and helped us redraft one of the pieces of the paper, which was very helpful. But we also have a very, very thorough and deep discussions with our members in terms of trying to determine how much these two trends go together and how much can we address them together. Because the whole purpose is not to discover the warm water, as the Secretary General said. We all know, we have been discussing productivity trends for many years in our economies, how to be more productive, how to increase the output growth per input. But we have also been documenting how much inequalities of income and opportunities are harming this growth and productivity. The real question here is, do we bring them together or not? The real question here is, are there policies that by trying to push productivity are going to increase inequality? Or are there policies that by trying to reduce inequalities in terms of minimum wage or redistribution policies that will also make difficult for businesses to thrive and to be successful? So this is a real question, and this is what we really want to put together, because the whole concept of productivity and inclusiveness is to say life is not as simple as you think. Policies have unintended consequences, and the policies you choose to address one of the aspects of this equation might harm the other side. So just let's be very careful. The Secretary General commented on some of the work that we have done, and actually let me just not show that one, only that one, but we have been documenting the future of productivity, and this is one of the conclusions. You saw it. It's a general trend. It's a trend, the productivity slowdown, the slowdown on the growth of productivity in advanced and emerging economies. It's a real trend that is happening since the 90s. Of course, the level of productivity in some advanced economies is high, but in any case, is slowing down in terms of growth. So that's something to worry about. In emerging economies, it's different. Productivity levels are low and are also decreasing. And you remember, productivity is the best indicator of the increased living standards in our economy. So this is a worrisome trend. We also know, and this starts to bring into the fore the question of inequality, because it's homogeneous in all the economies, but it's not homogeneous across sectors or across industries or across firms. You have very well-performing firms that continue to see their productivity increase very widely. You see it there. We call it the frontier firms. 3.5% growth in the last decade. But you also have those other firms that are just lagging behind and cannot see how to improve the way they produce and they work. So this is another puzzle that also shows how much productivity and inequality are linked. And actually, if we take this conversation forward and we look at the difference in productivities across countries, and Cesar Hidalgo worked this mapping in Harvard with Ricardo Hausmann. Ricardo Hausmann has said that the most entrenched inequality aspect of relationship across countries is inequality of productivity. That's what really characterizes the difference between thriving and laggard countries. So what we did with this report actually was, yes, to confirm what our work in inequality and our work on productivity has been telling us, and this is something that the OECD is part of our soul, is part of what we do in terms of digital, in terms of skills, in terms of the macroeconomic settings, in terms of the structural policies. But what we did with the report is actually to see how much we can recognize the trends that link these two things together. Do they have common factors that explain them? Do they have linkages? Do they have some causality? I know that for some members the causal link was not really confirmed yet, but we were requested to continue with this work. And I actually have to say that, of course, there are always the unsung heroes, and here we have Ambassador Serrano, who was so determined not to let us talk only about productivity or inclusiveness, but to talk about the two trends, and the Secretary General, who's always very, very open to new ways of looking at things. So what are we looking at? I really want you to take, this is the income inequality. You have seen it in all of the countries. You will be happy if you are in the left side, but in reality, every single country has been experiencing increased inequalities, and this is even before the crisis and before the declined productivity in the 90s. We can say, okay, this trend might have also impacted the productivity of our economies, because it started even before we documented the decreased growth and productivity. So this is where we are. You will have many policies to reallocate resources. You will have many policies to increase the intake of technology by industry or in firms. You might have policies to increase the skills. And on the other hand, you might have policies actually to rebuild the capacity of tax and transfer systems to equalize where economies and where societies are. But what we're really looking at is at, oh, why somebody took my graph? Bring back my graph. The nexus, as the ESG said, this is the center. We really want to see how much this piece in the middle is explaining and probably providing us with very good insights of how much we can treat them together. And there are some answers that the ESG also mentioned, but that we really need to look into it, because it's not only about a social agenda issue, and this is, again, no silos. This is a new economic, the new approaches to economic challenges. Is not only about economic policies or macroeconomic, it's just a combination of all of them that could give us better results. Where do we find some links? First, inequalities of income, education, training opportunities, health, and access to quality jobs of new technologies likely reduce aggregate productivity and growth because they prevent people and firms and regions from realizing their full potential. And this is the whole thinking. How do you bring the people that is lagging behind? And if you see a children that does not receive the right education, we are wasting him. We're wasting not, of course, there is a moral issue, there is an ethical issue, there is a human rights issue, but there is an economic issue because these children would not be able to fulfill their full potential, and the same happens for firms and the same happens for regions. Our work on inequalities proved actually that the lack of investment in skills of the bottom 40% of the population, and I always hate to say bottom 40, because we become used to these things. It's not bottom, it's half of the population. And the World Bank talks about the bottom 40, and we talk about the bottom 40. I wish we could say the bottom 5%, because then you will say those that are excluded from the more dynamic part of the economy. This is 40% of the population of the OECD countries. So our work on inequalities proved by the lack of investment and skills on those bottom 40% of the population. Inequality harms growth because you do not invest in skills, as I said. But we even have worrisome evidence of worsening academic outcomes across generations. In 2012, 1 in 6 young adults aged 25 to 34 attained a lower level of education than their parents. This is worrisome. This is the 21st century. And it's not only about the expectations, but because we know that due to the crisis and due to the low growth scenario and look to the impact, the younger generations think that their lives will not be as successful as their parents. These are perceptions which we need to counter because they create a lot of instability and a lot of despair. But the reality is that with our PISA tool, we have confirmed that they are also obtaining a lower level of education of their parents, and this is completely wrong. Second, growing productivity dispersion across firms is likely to have contributed to widening of the wage differentials. This means productivity or workers with high skills work in high productivity firms. Therefore, there is a kind of sorting out. And what happens? Those high skilled people already arrive to the labor market with good qualities to work. They invest in training. They are exposed to the most advanced technologies, and they are ready to continue improving their own capacities to contribute. While, as you saw with the laggard firms, the others just stay behind. And additionally, we have also confirmed that wages have not kept up to the productivity growth when it grows. Third, the so-called skill-biased technological change hypothesis might also have led to job polarization. Standard routine work has declined as a share of employment by over 20% during the 90s, while highly skilled, high-wage increased. And this is also something that the OECD will looking at in the digitalization strategy. Fourth, competition settings in general, in the context, but also in the context of the digital economy, might lead to winner-take-all dynamics that we need to understand better, because of course these firms have a very, very great advantage in terms of the knowledge of the setting. But also we can think about rent or regulatory capture when you have very, very big economic powers that are determining how the politics work, because we also have this link between the politics and the economics. So badly framed regulatory and competition settings, both to allow for entry and exit, also might have trapped workers and firms in unproductive activities and preventing the reallocation of resources. And we know sometimes in some countries, I won't mention which ones, it's very difficult to get out of the market, even if you have shrinking income and profits. And this is really something that doesn't help to have the churn and the creative destruction that helps productivity increase. And finally, we have some evidence of cases where the finalization of the economy, that means the growing size of the financial markets of the economy, might also harm productivity and inclusiveness. This is something we need to confirm. Now, it's very nice for the organization to be sharing all this evidence and to be sharing all these insights that we have gained through the work that we have done, and where every single member country, through the Council, but also through the different committees contributing their intake. More importantly, we are a policy-based organization, so the real question here is how do we look at the policy interventions that help both in the productivity and on the inclusiveness, and actually, as I said, to choose those that we are sure are not going to harm the other side of the equation. That's the whole purpose. Whenever you choose a policy, just make sure that by improving one setting, you do not harm the other one. Win-win policies, of course, education policies, and we always say that, but it's not education in general. The OECD has also worked at length on quality education, getting the right skills to the right sectors, continue with the training of workers, lifelong learning, equipping workers actually to deal with the fast-paced work, and not only also the cognitive skills, but also those skills that will help them in terms of social, emotional, and also self-confidence and areas in which this is very important for them to fulfill their own potential. The second area is for individuals to succeed, you need firms to succeed. And this is very important. We cannot package them all together. It's not the capital labor equation as we usually put it, because there are so many firms that cannot make their ends meet. And we really need to take a hard look how competition help or not the small and medium-sized enterprises. How do we diminish the power of incumbents and broaden the space for challenger firms? And we also need to make sure that companies have access to finance, have access to technology, and have access to high-quality skills, which is not always the case. Next, policy insights must take a regional and local circumstances into account, because regions and cities have a key role to play in promoting local policies that reduce or remove the various limited accesses to opportunities. And these, I'm talking at housing, I'm talking at transport policies, I'm talking infrastructure, and as usual, like individuals, like firms, like regions, some of them accumulate disadvantages. It's just accumulation. You don't invest in infrastructure because there's no critical mass. You don't invest in skills because you need to put the money where it will give you more higher outcomes. But the reality is that these regions, firms, and people are just left behind. So the message is very clear. We think that economies might be wasting resources. Economies, by not investing in their people and by not allowing people, firms, and regions to fulfill their full potential, might be losing points at gaining higher levels of growth, but it might also be impacting the productivity equation. We will continue to work on these issues. We hope that, I don't know if by the end of the panel, John, we will have a different outcome. I hope that we will be able to convince you that there is a link. There is a link, and we must be open to look at the different approaches to probably get better outcomes than what we have today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gabriela, for that very clear exposition of the issues we're going to focus on. And so I'd just like to start by asking Eric Lebay of the McKinsey Global Institute about the productivity question. I think what we'll do is we'll discuss productivity and maybe then some of the issues to do with inequality, whether or not, and then when they're linked. So Eric, just starting off with productivity, is there a productivity problem, and what is the problem?
Thank you, John. So I would start by saying we have a productivity requirement. If we look at the global growth, taking the last 50 years and the next 50 years, on the last one, the growth of the world was roughly 3.6%. And it was 50-50 between labor growth and productivity growth, 1.8 and 1.8, roughly each. When you look at the next 50 years, the labor growth is going to be lower because of demographics. It's not going to be 1.8, it's more going to be around 0.3, maybe 0.6 maximum, which then puts a huge requirement on the productivity element to sustain the growth. If we were going to keep a 1.8, then we go to a 2.1 growth rate, maybe 2.4 growth rate. And if we take a GDP per capita perspective, not only the overall growth, but GDP per capita, to continue the same trend, we need to raise productivity to 2.1, 2.2. So this question about raising productivity over the next 50 years is an absolute requirement if we want to keep the standard of living, or at least a progression of the standard of living of the world. And obviously there is going to be a mix between emerging countries, developed countries, but just to set the stage, even if we have seen a decline in productivity in the last few years, the requirement, or at least the importance of raising productivity going forward, is going to be critical just to continue to keep some growth of the well-being or standard of living. Maybe a second element then is it possible? And somehow when we go deep, sector by sector around the world, looking at automotive or agriculture or retail, there is positive news. At least you have done some deep dives, and on a global basis, we can foresee 3% plus in some of these sectors. And by doing what? On one side, everybody catching up with best practices, at least countries by countries, evolving the regulation, evolving the innovation construct. But so raising basically, the productivity of the different sectors. But the second is also going to be new innovation, new technologies for 25% of this productivity growth. So the question then is going to be, if this is a potential, 3% plus productivity growth in many sectors, is going to be how do we capture that? And as I mentioned, a lot of it is going to be linked to regulation. Are sectors regulated to capture this productivity growth, as well as labor market, in terms of do we have the right skills to capture, to get this innovation going, this best practice implemented, and so on. Last element, maybe as an introduction on productivity, is it's important to also take a long perspective on productivity. And when I say long, it's not only the 50 years, but even to see the impact of some of these elements 10 to 15 years. If I just look at the solo paradox that was in the 1990s, a question about we see IT investment, but we don't see productivity impact. It has taken 10 years somehow to find the productivity impact of the IT investment at the end of the 90s in many sectors. There's been a huge productivity growth at that time, and it was mainly in 6 or 7 sectors, including retail, wholesale, banking, telecom, semiconductor. And the reason for that is to somehow what I was mentioning before, regulation and innovation. Huge competition, opening up some of the competitive intensity in some of these sectors, plus some innovation around technologies or ways to serve customers. And when you put that together, then you get this impact on productivity. So I think it's also here we have looked at we have seen some numbers in the past few years. Obviously, they are what they are. The question is, are some of the elements, and we may come back in the discussion on the impact of technology right now on productivity, but it may be in the next 5 to 10 years that we are going to see the productivity impact of this transformation. As in the 90s, it took 10 to 15 years to see the productivity impact of some of this investment in IT.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask Diane roughly the same question about the productivity issue, and when did we start seeing it?
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. And thanks to Gabriella for a very interesting scene setter there. The productivity slowdown is a post-2008 phenomenon. And one of the puzzles in trying to think about the nexus is that the increase in inequality long predates that. And in fact, it dates back to the 1980s, and if anything, has gone into reverse a bit since 2008. And I think in discussing this also, we need to be aware that the United States is very different from other countries. It has much higher levels of inequality. It has much different labour market opportunities for people than other OECD countries. But a lot of what we read about, particularly about technology, concerns what's happening in United States markets. So I think that's an important caution. Now, economists are pretty clear that technology has been one of the drivers of increased inequality. The demand for the kind of skills that allow people to work with computers and get good jobs and high pay has gone up faster than the supply of workers who can fill those jobs. So there's been this very familiar hollowing out of the labour market we've seen, all those middle-income, steady, middle-class jobs not growing, whereas the very high-paid jobs have, and also some very low-paid jobs have. So the popular story is that automation is still one of the drivers of what's happening in terms of inequality. But then if that's the case, that productivity slowdown is a real puzzle. Because if companies were investing now in autonomous cars and digital assistants and all of those things, we'd be seeing much better productivity figures. So there is a puzzle. I think they are linked. Part of the issue is how we actually conceptualize and measure productivity in a services-based economy with lots of intangibles and lots of digital innovation. And the issues range from how we classify sectors and how we capture what's happening in software or what's happening in the games industry when they don't actually fall within existing classifications. But it's also what's digitalization doing to activity. If people are switching to free activities online, they're switching away from marketed activities captured in GDP. There are the kind of delays that Eric was just talking about. The biggest civil engineering project in the UK at the moment is Crossrail, being built through London. It could not have been built without visualization and big data techniques, and those techniques will also allow much faster maintenance and diagnosis of problems when the trains are running, and those innovations aren't being captured anywhere in the measures. I think we should also acknowledge that these high-tech services are bringing real advantages to people on low incomes. And again, this is something that isn't picked up. It's disparagingly referred to as the gig economy. But free services or lower price services because of digital innovation and competition are very good for people on low incomes. If anything, it's the only good thing that's happened to people on low incomes in the past 8 years, that you can now get so much for free. And also the access to income and jobs in these kinds of sectors. I'm looking now at a data set for Airbnb rentals in European cities, which will be published in a couple of weeks. There are very few professional Airbnb hosts in these thousands and thousands of observations. Mostly they are people earning a bit of extra money through the new technologies. So this is a long-winded way of saying I think there's a lot we don't understand, there's a lot we don't measure. But for me, the place to look for the nexus, the connections, is in the point that Eric ended on, which is the competition. I think competition has decreased in our economies. There is less scope for high productivity firms to come into new markets and grow. There's less churn of the kind that has driven productivity increases in the past. So look at that, and look also at high pay in the corporate sector and the financial sector, and what we can do to stop that ratchet of pay at the top end of the scale if you really want to tackle inequality.
Thanks, Dan. I'll just ask you one question about that. If we're not really measuring productivity correctly, and there's all sorts of things going on that we're just missing, shouldn't people just be getting rich? Shouldn't we see it in income and wealth if there's this thing happening that we just aren't capturing the statistics? How do we know that what you're suggesting is true? Well, or how would we know?
There are issues about how we capture the income figures as well as the output and expenditure figures. So it's both sides of that set of accounts. And there is also, this is where the distribution point comes in, because even if there are some gains lower down the income distribution, those gains might disproportionately be going to people at the top of the income distribution. So competition in these sectors and competing away oligopolistic or monopoly rents is going to be one of the policy areas that needs to be addressed.
Okay, I'll ask Eric another question. We've heard about these frontier firms, and Gabriela produced some statistics about how certain firms in the economy are investing heavily or getting much better productivity results. And then there's a whole, by implication, there's a whole set of other firms that aren't doing this. Either they have the wrong skills or not enough technology, or they're not very good or something. Is that a new phenomenon? I mean, surely there are always good firms and bad firms. Why should this be a greater phenomenon of the modern economy, Eric?
I think it has, you always had frontier firms, but I think the digitalization is putting this question at a higher level of impact, I would say, on the economy as well as on the question. Just to give maybe an additional fact vis-à-vis what Gabriela was saying, I think we're on the same page. We looked at digital firms in America right now, and we are doing the same study in Europe, but not yet published. In America, somehow we have, when you look at the firms that are digital, and here when I say digital, it's not only IT investment, it's also digital in the way they work, digital the way they interact with customers, with suppliers, the way they are digital inside in terms of how they work. And here, again, it's not only the Amazon and Googles, it's also a lot of the classic firms that have become digital, because there are many firms that have adapted over time. When we look at the firms, therefore, that are ahead of their group, I would say sector by sector, they have better economic performance, better growth, 3 times the growth rate of their peers, 2 times on profit, 4 times on productivity. But also, interestingly enough, and this is where we link back to the inequality question, or at least 2 times on wage growth. And therefore, they are better paying somehow their employee, partly because of their skills, partly because of the productivity growth, so they are able to bring that back to their employee. And therefore, they are in a better, I would say, better dynamic, and therefore, continuing to grow. So the question is going to be, how are the others going to catch up? And this is where I would, in fact, concur also with some of the points Gabriela was making, which is when we look at, how do we get basically more transformation in companies, it's going to be back to, are the opportunities able to be created? Do we have the right regulation? Do we create the right new opportunities? Here, just as an example, for example, or the open data question. If data is open, you can create opportunities. If data is not open, it's more difficult to create opportunities. So our regulations, opening up the opportunities for companies to create new things. But the second is going to be the labor market ability to somehow reallocate the human capital. Can company make the productivity adjustment they need to make, as well as investment in the new skills? Because they need to basically reallocate their capital from their old business or old way of doing things to the new way of doing things. And this has been, in some countries, a bit difficult to do, both to do the reallocation as well as to get the new skills. So this is, I would say, an increasing question to be addressed to ensure we don't have only frontier firms, but that the middle of the pack, in fact, is moving to the frontier and get this productivity gain as well as this wage growth I was mentioning.
Okay, thank you. I'll turn to Francis. Francis, your organisation, the Trades Union Congress, represents workers across the board, and many of them working in advanced high-tech manufacturing services. Others, maybe among the 40% that we've heard about, that aren't capturing these opportunities. So when we hear about these frontier tech firms, they all sound jolly good. They're investing heavily. They have high-wage employees. Are you optimistic about that development?
I'm always optimistic. But I think the key concern for workers, not just in Britain but elsewhere, is that we've got too few of those high-value, high-skilled, high-paid jobs, and too many of the, as we call them in Britain, sports direct, on 0 hours, low pay, low skill, with, frankly, little incentive to perform highly in that workplace when your boss treats you as disposable. I think, for me, perhaps the question really should be to what extent inequality is preventing our economies improving in terms of performance and productivity, because I think we need to address the root causes of this problem. We've got millions of workers feeling very insecure on low pay, seeing top pay continue to soar, and this isn't just a moral question. We know that it leads to poor decision-making in boardrooms. It starves companies of investment. Too much profit is going into top pay and into dividends for short-termist strategies that are not high productivity ones. So we have to challenge that. It's also having a real impact on demand. Again, in Britain, people's living standards have been held down for years. Workers are still £40 a week worse off than they were before the crash. They are not going to go out and buy goods and services unless their wages improve. Similarly, it's having an impact on our tax base alongside austerity policies that are starving our physical and human infrastructure of the investment that we need to get more people skilled, to get more apprentices, to ensure that workers are healthy and educated and can get to work. And then finally, I think it's also having an impact on investment. And unless, low investment and low productivity go hand in hand, unless we get more long-term investment in companies, we will have fewer BMWs and more Sports Directs, and that's going to be bad, I think, not just economically, but as we've seen in Austria, France, the debate on Brexit in the UK, it's destabilizing for the political economy too.
Okay, I'll turn to Cesar. Cesar at the MIT Media Lab it studies lots of very interesting new digital and media models. What's your observation about some of these frontier firms and how it affects productivity and maybe inequality as well?
So on that, I think I have like a few comments. So one of the things that I think the internet has been great at is at generating value, but not necessarily at monetizing it. So if you think about it, what has Google, Facebook, and Twitter done in terms of business? They've displaced NBC, CBS, they displaced like media businesses that were on advertisement. At the same time, they've created a lot of opportunities for people, to learn new things that are not necessarily being monetized through those services. So there is a big now gap between the ability of the internet to generate value and for that value to be monetized and enter into GDP. Another point is that actually now when you look at inequality, you have to consider also that it's not a purely institutional phenomenon. I think we kind of all agree on that. That it also has a strong link with the industrial structure of a country. So we have a paper that now under review in which we look at the connection between economic complexity and income inequality. The complexity of an economy can be approximated by looking at the diversity of the mix of products that they make and how sophisticated these are. And we find that actually countries that have more complex economies tend to have much lower levels of inequality. Countries that increase their complexity over time see their inequality reduced. And what this is telling us is that when we're thinking about inequality, we have to figure out, how that is linked not only to the institutions that a country has, but to their productive structure, because maybe that productive structure is begetting these institutions. It's very hard to be a very unequal country when you have the productive structure of Switzerland or Denmark, and it's very hard to be a very egalitarian economy when you have a productive structure that is geared towards natural resources like that of Chile. So it's not just an institution story, it is also a story about industrial structures, and that also tells us that, well, different industries probably beget, different institutions internally, within them. Now, finally, in the context of productivity, I think we have discussed so far productivity mostly from a supply side. We're talking about skills, we're talking about how to maybe help, people create work in a way that is more efficient. But productivity, of course, because of the way we measure it, has a strong demand-side component. I'm a writer. I publish books. When I publish a book, the amount of work that goes into it did not change the moment the book got published. But if all of a sudden there's a surge on demand and I sell twice the number of books, my productivity kind of doubled, no? Because it's revenue divided by my cost. Yeah? So in a world in which consumption is low because of inequality, and consumption is going to be low when inequality is high because people that are at the bottom of the scale, if you increase their salaries a little bit, that's probably going to go into consumption. It's not going to go that much into saving. The people at the top, they don't need to consume all that they make. So in that world in which actually inequality is large and growth is low, we should expect, because of this demand side effect of productivity, for productivity to also be relatively small. Simply because revenues are not there, so you have a lot of idle time or a lot of effort that then is not matched by a sales effort that transforms that into revenue on the other side of the business.
Okay, so I guess one question is, are we seeing at the frontier of technology, are we seeing Apple or Uber? And I guess what I mean by that is, are we seeing very high productivity, high wage firms, or are we seeing firms that in effect are delivering a lot of benefits to consumers by squeezing out wages? Do you have any reflections on that, Eric? Or Diane?
I think we're seeing both. And the outcome for workers, and I think Francis touched on this, is going to depend on what other options they have. And the reason that there are some companies that get away with zero-hour jobs, pretty low pay and so on, are because the people working in those companies don't have other opportunities. And partly that is the demand side story, the post-crash story, and of course we need more demand so companies want to invest and people want to buy products. But it's also about the supply side. There's a real shortage of skills to get the jobs that complement the new technologies and will be rewarded with high pay. Real shortage of skills. And education systems simply have not adapted for the past 20 years. So I think this is becoming a really urgent problem if you want to tackle inequality. And I'd also say that the investment story is partly about corporate pay structures too, because people who run big companies aren't rewarded for investing and creating good jobs. They're rewarded for getting the share price up because their share incentives schemes. And that's something that isn't talked about very much, but I think it's actually a really important part of this whole nexus, not just because they're getting a lot of money, but because it's actually discouraging corporate investment.
Okay, so you raised some very interesting questions there, and one of them is this supply-side issue of education and skills. I mean, to me, I've been hearing for 20 or 30 years about the upskilling of the economy, the way in which we're losing lower-skilled jobs or pay is being squeezed in lower-skilled jobs, and there is the need for people to get higher levels of education and vocational education. And there's some evidence that that's actually happened in economies. I mean, the participation in tertiary education in some OECD countries has gone up, and yet that doesn't seem to have solved the issue. So, Francis, what do you think is the issue for workers? Is it their responsibility to just get cleverer, or run faster?
Yeah, all of those things, no doubt, will be required to do. But I mean, I think there are a couple of problems here. Firstly, I think we need to demystify this issue of Uber that you touched on before. There's a lot of hype about the business model that Uber's pursuing. Again, this should be simple stuff. We've got political choices here. Do we want those workers in Britain to be supposedly self-employed when actually they have no choice about who they work for? Do we want them to be exempted from limits on working hours when they're driving people around? And do we want them paid less than the national minimum wage because they're not categorised as workers? I think that business model stinks. I think it should change, and I think we have the power through Europe and through national governments to do that. So we should. But this other question about skills, I mean, this one has run and run and run. And sometimes I fear can become a kind of displacement debate for tackling some of the root problems that we face. Certainly in Britain and in many other countries, we've seen massive cuts to our training and education system. So on the one hand, employers are worried that they haven't got the supply of skilled labour that they need. On the other hand, we have to encourage people to remember if you want it, you're going to have to pay your taxes for it. But also discourage governments from cutting the further education system that is absolutely key to many of those middle jobs that we've been talking about, the technicians that we need as much as the highly skilled.
Okay, thanks. I'd just like to turn to inequality specifically and just play devil's advocate for a minute. If you look at globally, across the past 20, 30 years, rather than within countries, inequality has decreased, largely because of the remarkable move out of poverty of many Chinese workers, hundreds of millions of Chinese workers and citizens. And I guess you could also say, well, look, inequality has certainly increased, but maybe that's a problem of success. There's more rich people. In countries where there were only poor people, it was very equal, but it was very poor. So I'd just like to get some perspectives on the panel of the economic development that we've seen broadly in the past 2 decades, and whether or not it's a good or a bad thing writ large. Gabriela?
But let me, because I wanted to comment on something that you asked, Francis, and this question of skills. And you mentioned the fact that our societies have acquired higher levels of education, and the school attainment of all the populations have increased both in advanced and developing economies. The fact is not the level of skills, it's the quality of skills. And in a very fast-paced world in which you need to be changing technology and you need to be adjusting your own ways of addressing these developments, is not about the kind of education systems that we have. I have to say that education systems are not prepared to give children not only the knowledge they need, because knowledge is not the problem, knowledge is out there, you can get it anywhere, it's not memorizing, but it's really the capacity of individuals to adapt their own skills to the requirements of this very fast-paced changing world and fast-changing technologies. And I don't think we're there. I really don't think we're there. Is more building the critical thinking, is more building the adaptability, the resilience, and the way in which they can continue investing in themselves and positioning themselves better for the labor markets. And we still have education systems that are based on 18th century structures. The other point that I want to comment on what we have been saying in terms of the diffusion machine, this is related to skills again, because what we call it at the OECD, the breakout of the diffusion machine, because before you have the leading firms who were innovating and bringing up new technologies, and there was always a possibility of this trickling down to other firms and sectors. This is not happening. We knew about the regulatory frameworks that might not help, but also the skills mismatch. And so the paradox is how much with more education everywhere, higher levels of education, you still have many companies reporting that they don't find the skills. So there is a real disconnection in terms of how much we can bring them all together. And then on the question of productivity and the definitions, and are we capturing really this gig economy? This is really a real puzzle. We are actually releasing today the compendium of productivity statistics. I don't know if Martin is here. But we have all these definitions, and the problem is that how do you capture tacit knowledge? We are not talking about these huge technological breakthroughs in the last century or the intake of the IT sectors that we saw in the 90s. We're seeing the change in knowledge-based capital and in organizational management systems. So this is, and finally to your question, I think that we are just need to get away from averages. We know more about inequality and what happened at the different income groups because we have more access to granular data, and therefore, if you measure China's progress only by looking at GDP per capita, you're just missing the whole distribution of outcomes in that economy. We're just missing how much there was, of course, and we cannot neglect the fact that many people came out of poverty. That was a big success in the last decade. But the reality is that the distribution of outcomes for the population is as unequal as everywhere, and we need to understand better, and we need to broaden the definition not only for income, outcomes related to income and wages, but outcomes related to well-being. And in reality, this is much more complex.
Okay, thanks very much. And so just on that last point, obviously we've seen this phenomenon in China and other developing countries with poverty alleviation, with economic development comes inequality. So just like, and in a way they're coming to match developing societies in that structure more. So I'd just like to ask other members of the panel, is that an inherent part of economic development? Is inequality an inherent part of economic development?
Well, that's the question of Kuznets' curve, yeah? So Kuznets proposed long time ago that as countries develop, and as their income rose, first inequality was going to go up, and then inequality was going to go down. And if you look at the data, actually, you do find some evidence for that. But after you start including a lot of controls, that evidence starts, in some cases, disappearing or starts getting weaker. So in a lot of the recent years, we have seen countries that have relatively low incomes see their inequality rise. And a lot of the effect of Kuznets' curve actually disappears once you remove Latin America out of the sample, meaning that Latin America happened to be a continent that was of middle income and high inequality, but when you remove it out of the sample and you look at countries like Malaysia, Malaysia went up in income, without increasing inequality, actually with inequality going down. The way that we explain that is that it's not about income, it's about the productive structure, and income is a very aggregate measure that in some way can be considered a proxy for it, but it is not. Chile and Malaysia have the same income, but they have and the same average years of schooling. If you look at human capital, they have, of course, different institutions, but they have a very different productive structure. Malaysia is geared towards manufacturing of electronics. Chile is geared towards, the extractive of raw materials. And those different productive structures obviously beget different ways of distributing that income. In the case of Malaysia, that income has to be distributed in the context of manufacturing, in which many people have to be included into the economy and where creative activities are more important. In the case of Chile, there's like a few firms, that are the ones through which basically all of the revenue is generated. So I would say there is a connection, between the level of development and the level of inequality, but it's not through the level of income. It is more through the productive structure. And once you incorporate that into your modeling, you realize that, like Kuznets' curve, in some way is an epiphenomena of something deeper that tells you that how you make things shape, how your society is.
Francis?
There is nothing inevitable about inequality. And what's more, I think we've all learned since the crash that this can be very, very bad for business as much as for workers. In fact, most of the business leaders I talk to want stability, they want certainty, they want the rule of law. And if that means that we need to find new ways to promote equality and redistribute wealth, then let's do that. But there are some tried and trusted ways, and perhaps a key kind of component perhaps that we need to discuss more is the role of trade unions and collective bargaining in we know there is evidence to show that where trade unions are present, we are more likely to get pay solidarity. We're more likely to, it's associated with higher performing workplaces because people feel more engaged, more empowered in their workplaces. They're more likely to get better skills, and they're more likely to encourage their companies to take the longer term decisions of investing in R&D and the long-term future success of a company rather than the short-term fast buck.
Okay, so I think you were getting into there a very interesting area, which is what we should do about it. But just before we do, let's ask the panel the central question, which we asked the audience right at the start. Are these two things linked? Is the productivity performance and inequality linked? And if so, how?
I'm not going to try to convince you all, but let me just come back to your question, which I think was a very old-fashioned question. Because the reality is that to say that inequality helps growth is kind of, we're missing the whole evidence. We're missing the fact that you have, as I said, 40% of the population that are not making their ends meet. And actually, to turn this conversation, because of course, when you talk to people that are really wanting to deliver high levels of growth, and then you say, okay, how much tolerance you have to inequality? Well, just deliver growth, and then we'll see how we fix the thing. So we grow first, and then we redistribute, and that's not working. We actually have come to a very good analytical piece that links inequality with growth and try to see how much inequality has prevented economies from growing faster. And we confirm that indeed high levels of income inequality had really bring growth down in even 7 percentage points in my own country, in Mexico, but 5 on average on many OECD economies. And the whole point, and this is again linked to productivity, is that the low-income groups do not invest in the skills of their children. Or even if they bring them to schools, the schools do not provide for quality education. And we know it. When I arrived to France, I said, I don't have a clue of the education system in France. Now I'm an expert, and it's very complex. But I said, which school should I send my children to? And they said, don't worry, choose the neighborhood. Choose the zip code, as President Obama would say. And this is terrible, because we know that children of certain neighborhoods with certain income levels will receive high-quality education and the rest will not. And that is a waste of the economies. And I really think we should be changing the way we frame this debate.
Okay, thanks. So I hope in not too old-fashioned a way, I'm going to go back to my question about the linkage, the central question that we're addressing today. Are these two things linked? Eric?
Okay. First, in fact, I wanted to come back to one point before addressing that, which is when you mentioned the global growth, I think we shouldn't forget that we have taken, we have moved from a world where 10% of the people were consumers, i.e., not in poverty, to a world in 2025 where it would be 53%. So more than half of the population of the world is going to be consuming in 10 years. And some of this is, major achievement in the world. At the same time, this is also the proof that there has been globalization of the skills, which is also one of the reasons why we are discussing inequality and lack of growth in some of the developed countries, because through this, getting a few billion people out of poverty, we have created a global market on low skill, on high skill also, which has created basically this skill mismatch we have been discussing before, both in terms of creating the new skills, upgrading the skills, as well as matching the skills of the requests of the companies with the skills of the people. And I would just reinforce the point I think Diane started making, which is the education institution have been really slow at adapting to the world. And for me, that's really core to the question we are debating, both on productivity and inequality. If we are asking this institution, are you basically developing your students for what they need? 75% of the institutions say, yeah, we are good. We ask the students and the companies, do you find the right people? 25% say yes, or the student says, I've been prepared for my job. So this question of closing the gap between the quality of what the institution of education are doing and are providing, as well as what is required in the market, I think is core to both the question of productivity and inequality. And it's a way of, I would say, of answering your question about, is there a linkage? For me, the linkage is between the growth, are we able to get the growth going, which is really going to be skill-based as well as opportunity-based. I was mentioning before, is regulation there to enable the creation of the new opportunities? And we see that in some countries, there has been some limitation to that, to move to the 21st century or to open up to new opportunities. So do we get these new opportunities there? And the second is, do we get the labor mobility, both in terms of skill upgrade, both in university as well as in the labor market, to basically get these skills to the opportunities that are going to be created. And if we do this, somehow we answer, or at least we improve on both sides.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to ask Cesar, actually, that question about whether or not there's a link. And also, the OECD is coming up with some suggestions for measures that maybe countries should start thinking about it. Are those suggestions good enough?
So first on the link, I think we discussed a number of linkages, like Gabriela emphasized the fact that when you have inequality and you have no opportunities, people at the bottom should not invest on skills, and that could aggravate the situation. We discussed demand side linkages too, and I think we can also argue that there are no linkages if we would think, for example, that to increase productivity, you need to develop inclusive institutions. So I would say there is a link between them, but that link doesn't mean that they're always going to co-vary, because in some sense it's going to depend on, among all of the links that exist between productivity and other factors or other phenomena, and inequality and other phenomena, sometimes the one between productivity and inequality is going to be the link that is going to be prevalent, and in other cases, it's not going to be that. So there's a link, but it is a little bit more complex. Now, when it comes to the policy recommendation, I think this is where it gets more fun, no? Yeah? Okay, and
I thought it's been quite fun so far.
So, and I have to say, Gabriela, that you got me at a bad time because I'm a professor at MIT, and at this time of the year, basically what I spend most of my weeks doing is reviewing students' theses. So when I read executive report, I couldn't help but evaluate it as yet another of the tens of theses that I have to review every April, and to come up with some critical comments. And I have some critical comments actually that I prepared, which I hope are useful. These are in the spirit of helping, but they're going to be a little bit critical nevertheless. So my first criticism is that many of the policy recommendations are actually quite unspecific, and I think a lot of the conversation that we had here is very unspecific. And I quote, "We need to look at policies aimed at ensuring that all individuals are equipped to and supported in fulfilling their productive potential with adequate investments in skills and health and good opportunities for quality jobs." So my comment to that is, of course, we all would like a world in which everyone is skilled, healthy, have good job, but the question is, how do we get there? And I find that in some sense, those type of descriptions do not get there. And the report goes on, they request adequate safety nets without describing what they are or how to implement them. Labor market activation policies, what are those? How do they look actually when the rubber meets the road? So what I want to do is talk about two other policy implications that I think we could discuss if we think about our model of development a little bit different. Because the reason why I think there are some coarse and unspecific policy implications in the report is because there is only one model of development, which is the one that is prevalent here when people talk about economies as a plural. Okay? When you talk about economies as a plural, instead of economy of the world as one thing, basically you are accepting that there's a fragmentation of those economies that is actually something that is imposed by some policy restrictions. Because when we think about development, there's two ways of thinking about development. On the one hand, we can think of development of places. And on the other hand, we can think of development of people. And these are not the same thing. When you think about development of places, basically you're trying to figure out how, within a circumscribed territory, you can improve the capacity of the people in that place, but you are willing to accept that you could enforce people from other places to come there. When you think about development of people, you're actually thinking that eventually maybe the movement of people might be the one that can unlock the largest increases in productivity and global development. So in some way, it's important to think about these differences, because if you think that the world can be developed in the context of the development of places, it means that you think that you can engineer development. And if you can engineer development, then development should travel quite easily. But in a world in which you realize that you cannot engineer development, because development is something that we have never been able to engineer, but has nevertheless emerged organically in a few parts of the world, then, well, you're going to think that maybe we should not try to engineer development. You should try to bring and include people in the places that are developed. So to paraphrase Sir Francis Bacon, should we bring Mohammed to the mountain, or should we bring the mountain to Mohammed? And I think we cannot move mountains. So in some sense, the elephant in the room that we need to discuss, which is the first policy that I would recommend, which is quite specific, is labor mobility. Yeah? Labor mobility is a very a specific policy, because let's face it, the elephant in the room here is that we live in a world in which the right to work is not a universal human right. To work anywhere in the world, most people need to ask for permission. You know? That permit is called a work visa. And anywhere in the world, if you want to sell your labor, it would be illegal for you to do so without having that permit. So we have achieved a globalization of everything but labor, with the hope that, A, if we allow people to maybe trade goods freely, they're going to be able to arbitrage those wage differences, and we're going to make this inequality disappear. But trade liberalization is almost complete by now, and that hasn't happened. No, there's very little that we can win. But if you look at the estimates that people have put on labor mobility, they say 0.5 percentage point of the labor force of developed countries, if it were to come from developed countries, it would equal all foreign aid. The estimate for global labor mobility would be to double world's GDP.
Okay, let's. We're gonna very briefly discuss labor mobility, and then we're going to take. I'm going to ask some questions from the audience, and I'm going to, by the way, steal 10 minutes of time since we started late. Yeah, but there's been an awful lot of labor mobility within the European Union and across the Mexican border, and it doesn't seem to be making governments very happy. Free movement of labor.
Yeah, so like, of course, because labor mobility...
An economist might say it's a very good thing, but...
It's going to be unpopular because when labor mobility happens, the one that accrues the benefits is the one that moves. So let's say you have a guy that is average, of average income in Peru, and that person moves to the US, and now it's below average income. The GDP of Peru went down, and the GDP of the US went down, but the GDP of the world went up. You know?
Okay, no,
yeah,
I take your point.
Exactly.
Okay, has anybody got any thought about that, Francis?
I just wanted to concentrate.
I mean, your members actually, some of your members benefit from labour mobility, but you could argue that other members get squeezed by it.
Labour mobility is great as long as you've got protections in place for workers. So we've got, it's very clear that overall free movement in Europe is good for economies. The evidence from the LSE and others is there. But if you're a worker on a building site and your boss brings in other workers from Eastern Europe on agency contracts and less pay, and then says, so you're going to get less pay too, it's not so good. So again, the question is, what are the prescriptions? It seems to me that since there's hopefully a consensus that inequality is a bad thing and a problem for all of us, but we're now moving into a period where some people say, well, in order to deal with it, you have to be cruel to be kind. So take workers' rights away, and somehow that will lead to the growth, and it will trickle down. And we've heard this before. Others of us say those old-fashioned solutions do not work. In fact, what we need to do is strengthen workers' rights, strengthen their representation and voice and power in the workplace, so that they can share in the benefits of productivity.
Okay.
And that's the big debate now.
Okay, actually, if you forgive me, I'm going to move on to a couple of questions from the audience who've been very well behaved so far, but you never know. So one question, which relates to something Francis was just saying, should we have a maximum pay law as well as minimum pay laws? If there's a problem with wage inequality, should we just legally cap wages? Anybody?
Yep. I would certainly cap bonuses, because in any complex modern organisation, it's very hard to attribute outcomes to any single individual. So I'd be very pleased to cap bonuses, and something like 10% maximum. I think they are much better awarded to people doing jobs that are easily measurable. Working in a fast food restaurant, for example, if you do that better, you deserve a bonus. If you're chief executive, you don't. And I wouldn't actually cap pay, but I would really change these upward ratchet corporate pay structures that we have. And that can only be done by regulatory intervention, because no company's remuneration committee is going to be the first one to do that.
Okay, I've got another question from the audience, which is about graduates and the skill levels. And the question is, graduates, or it's an observation, graduates are better trained than ever, there's more of them, but they're still not finding jobs. Why? Yeah, Gabriela.
This is exactly what I was mentioning. The fact is that probably the education systems need to start coping with the demands of the labor market. Of course, education is not only about providing the skills for getting a job. We, of course, hope that education serves much more higher purposes. But the reality is that it's not equipping the kids to really have the skills they need to go into the labor markets. But I want to capture the mic because I have a right of replica. First, Cesar, because of course the recommendations of the report are very high level. We did it like that, no, Ambassador? The fact is that the real conclusion of the report is that you cannot get specific policies without getting into the specific conditions of the countries you are talking about. Because when you say, okay, what kind of social safety nets, tell me what country. If you ask me for Mexico, I have one answer. If you ask me for France, I have another one. What is, well, it needs to make it sustainable. The reality is that they have very well developed social safety nets, and they have a very high public investment in every single sector. They have the best health system. They have good quality education, universal coverage. They have very good infrastructure. The only point is that you need to make it sustainable. The only one thing that is really cutting across all the advanced economies, which are the most developed in terms of the institutional settings and a lot of these mechanisms for redistribution, is that the tax and benefit system has decrease in their efficiency in terms of reducing market inequality, market income inequality. So I would say yes to your quest to be more specific. We will do it in the next round, and maybe you can help us write the second chapter. That will be welcome. And the other point, migration. Migration is about integration. I agree. I think that we are missing sometimes the level of interconnectedness and the capital movements and all the kind of linkages that our countries have, the restrictions to labor movement, but it's also about how do you integrate those migrants and how we make economies successful in terms of really taking advantage of their skills, and this is another challenge.
Great, thank you very much.
John?
You got that response free. You have to pay good money to go to MIT and get Cesar to tell you your essay is no good.
Yeah, I wanted just to come back on the previous question about the graduate not finding jobs with 2 points. The first one is obviously the topics, because when we look at, we look, for example, at France, you get, for example, 80,000 people graduating in psychology. You may not need as many in a country. On the other hand, we are missing 150,000 data scientists right now. So the question is really going to be what kind of skills do we get at time T on which we have opportunities on the other side. And therefore, maybe on the policy side, it may be simply to get, how do we get the companies and the institution to work together? In this country, they are very, one does one thing, the other one do the other thing. Other countries are working better than that. But when we get at the operational level in clusters or region or agglomeration, the institution of education plus the companies around the table, then they can foresee what do we need in 5 years or 3 years and get the right people. So this question for me is going to be at least practically a way of solving the first point, the question. And the second idea, we have studied that last year, is now we have a lot of digital platforms that are enabling matching skills, offering and supply. Be the LinkedIn, be the Monster.com, be the Uber and others. They may be, they may need maybe to adapt, but somehow matching through digital can increase also GDP by 1 or 2 points. So back to the opportunity creation, the skill matching, there are ways of doing that right now in a better way and providing growth and therefore solving some of the inequality question.
Okay, I've got another question which has found its way to me magically through advanced technology from the audience. And it's a very topical one. Guaranteed basic income. That's what a lot of people are talking about. Does anybody have any views on whether or not societies should move to simply offering a basic income to everybody?
I think Diane also wants to say something, so I'm going to pass on then the mic to her if that's okay with you. But to be honest, I don't think it's such a stupid idea. I think we live in a world in which a lot of people now are in a position of producing large amounts of surplus with relatively small teams. And in that world, what we're struggling with is what I call like a great separation. For the longest time, we have coupled production with consumption, meaning that every month, you produce, and in exchange for that, you get some consumption credits that then you use to go into the market and consume. and we put those two things together, but in reality, they're two separate things. One thing is the consumption credits that I get, and another thing is the things that I produce, and we assume because of like marginal theory that I get enough consumption credits based on how much I contribute to the economy and that the system is all fair if you're neoclassical, yeah? But now we live in a world in which a few people can produce, goods or can produce services that can serve many, Like a big company in Silicon Valley doesn't need to employ tens of thousands of people actually to deliver the services that they provide to billions. Yeah? So we're creating like a great level of inequality in the number of people that we need to serve other groups of people, and what we're struggling with is the consumption credits. Now, if we were to take Hayek seriously here, maybe we can say, hey, maybe one of the things that people provide to the economy that is valuable is not their production, but it's actually providing information about what needs to be produced through their acts of consumption. How valuable is that?
Okay.
Is $1,000 or $2,000 a month of value?
Okay.
And if that is the case, then you should assign the consumption credits.
I think that's a yes. Diane?
So I'm going to give a no. I'm going to give the opposite answer.
Oh, excellent.
Literally every time people have grown concerned about the effect of automation on jobs, the idea of basic income has come back. Now, I don't think it's a stupid idea. I think it's very sensible to have some pilot schemes and see how it works. But there is a great inherent conflict between directing tax revenues towards the poorest people and sharing tax revenues among everybody to provide a basic income. And I don't want to make that trade-off until we are absolutely sure that there is a problem about jobs, and we're not. There is no evidence that automation is reducing the level of employment independent of other things that are going on in the economy. The UK has a record high employment rate. There is no sign of rapid expansion of autonomous cars and so on taking away people's jobs. The OECD last week published estimates of the impact on jobs that was way, way lower than the scare stories that you see in the newspapers. So it might happen. I think it's important to test in some pilots the basic income idea to see how it works. But I think it's much too soon to decide that you will take away resources from the poorest people in society.
Okay, so we have actually run out of time, but we are going to ask the question again. What I would say about the panel is it's been bubbling with ideas. I'm not sure we've reached a very clear conclusion, but there's lots of issues that have been raised here. We were just getting on to robots and autonomous cars, which are going to be discussed in many of the other panels here over the next couple of days, so it's a very good start. But I'm going to give you, the audience, the final chance to give your views. I'm going to ask the same question again. In your view, are slow productivity growth and rising inequality linked? It's time to vote again. Let's see if you've changed your minds. Oh, you can say don't know, by the way. It's like the Brexit referendum. Okay, shall we try and show the vote?
So you could just do hands up.
No, we trust in technology here. Oh, look. Yes, they've changed their minds, the audience and the participants. So the discussion has actually moved in the OECD direction. So that's a very... and only 5% didn't know. So thanks very much. Since everybody's been so active, maybe you could ask one last question, which you're going to find in your app. Thank you, everybody on the panel, for the very dynamic discussion. And coming up in this room next, we're going to have a very suitable follow-on discussion on from a pre-digital to a digital economy. So thanks to the panel.